watch this. Dunkel sent this, and if Dunkel sends, it's good. So, let's do this. The Marvelization of cinema. From like stories of old. Fuck.
The cinema is changed. I feel it in the theater. I feel it at home. Much that once was is lost, for none now live.
Hang on. I'll be back around shortly. Do I really feel like we were connecting there?
When people talk about the Marvelization of cinema, you probably already have some idea of what that means. The constant quipping, the annoying self-awareness, the fact that everything has to be a franchise now. But these criticisms alone never quite seem to get at the heart of the issue, because for every franchise we criticize there seems to be another one that we praise, and for every joke that we cringe at there is a similar one that does land. So what is the actual problem? What does it really mean when we talk about the Marvelization of cinema? Well, in short, the problem, I think, has to do with a phenomenon called storytelling entropy, which is a term I made up in an attempt to offer a more unifying theory to explain, among other things, why you're no longer keeping up with Marvel like you used to, why you love some sequels but not all of them, where all these stupid jokes came from, why this worked and this didn't, and for that matter, why this didn't work either even though it definitely should have. And why so many grand productions with movie stars that you really like and with stories that have lots of potential nevertheless end up feeling completely hollow. This is the Marvelization problem.
One, I'm hooked. And two, this is... yeah. Why do some work and not others? I'm gonna give my predictions. This is going to have to do with the fact that some of these franchises are way too bloated now. For example, I was watching another video earlier today. This is not a Marvel woke video. This will be deep. Yeah, no, so I'm thinking the fact that, for example, Marvel is a bloated bloated brand. I was looking at a video from Phil Mento, who is I really like his videos. And his video was critiquing the Marvels and how there wasn't anything of substance in the movie. Everything of substance was homework for the movie. You had to have watched like 60 hours of other projects before you could even begin comprehending what was happening in the film. The films don't stand by themselves anymore, and the films are incapable of it. We also have the fact that writers don't know what to do with the material, that they're rushed, and all of this. So, Fundamentally, the third movie would have worked had the elves not jumped the phalanx. I haven't watched the Hobbit films, so let's continue.
This video is brought to you by Mubi. Go to mubi.com/likestoriesofold for an extended free trial.
Nice.
First off, to explain the basic idea of storytelling entropy, let's consider the lightsaber. The lightsaber might just be the most famous movie object ever created, with a look and sound that most people on the planet will instantly recognize. And more than that, it's not just that people know what it is, there's a good chance they also know what it stands for. Because the lightsaber is not just a weapon, it's a metaphor. By virtue of its design alone, which suggests up-close and personal combat, yet with a dignified and elegant touch. It symbolically communicates a lot about the philosophy of its wielder, and about the larger world it exists in.
Elegant weapon, but a more
the lightsaber
civilized
is a samurai sword.
It even
in
has
space.
a clear color coding to signify, well, you know. The point is that the lightsaber condenses a multitude of meanings and ideas into a simple singular object. And as such, we can see it as an example of anti-entropic storytelling. Anti-entropic because it renders disorder into order. It takes a plurality of story elements, unifies them, and then compresses them to their absolute essence. Consciously or unconsciously, we generally admire anti-entropic storytelling because it just adds so much richness to stories. And because it invokes the feeling that everything is meaningful, purposeful, and interconnected in a way that just makes sense. And though I've only been
Feels
discussing one
natural.
story element here, the same principle holds true for every aspect of storytelling. The characters, the plot, the world building, and so on. If you look at some of the most beloved movies ever made, you can clearly see this anti-entropic movement reflected in them. This intent to identify one core idea, and to then try and create the perfect encapsulation of this core idea by capturing it within every story element and every filmmaking technique, and by condensing it to its absolute essence.
Yeah, recently when we were in France with Dunkel, we watched the Cornetto trilogy, and I'm just thinking back, especially like my favorite of the three was, I think it was Hot Stuff. Everything in that movie adds up. Everything that is mentioned, everything that they're talked about, and it's a silly comedy. It's a silly British comedy, and Hot Fuzz. Yes, sorry, I'm thinking way too many things at the same time. And everything, like all three movies had that. Like Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz, World's End. All three had this. That every single thing that is said, brought up, or at some point, like everything that is even shown on screen builds up to something else down the line. Like the writing in that is just incredible. Incredible. And you don't get that feeling with so many of these films anymore. Like a lot of things just build up to nothing or are just completely discarded or forgotten about. And yeah, anti-entropic, I'm just going to call it coherent. So, is a sort of medieval elite warrior cast in space. Yes. Which movie is this again? Well, this is Matrix. But the ones I mentioned, that was the Cornetto trilogy, which is Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz, and World's End. Incredible, incredible films. Like, they immediately shot up to some of my favorite films ever. Not just because they're hilarious comedies, but because of just everything about them. When I say everything about them, it's everything about them. Every last bit about them just either builds up to something or is meaningful in some way. And it's just, yeah, let's continue.
These movies are obviously great, but from a writer's or filmmaker's perspective, they can also form a bit of a frustration.
Yeah.
Because going back to the lightsaber, when you have something as cool as this, you obviously want more. After all, you loved it, the audiences loved it, and also, it made a lot of money at the box office, and might make even more the second time around. But here's the problem. If you already have the perfect distillation of an idea, where do you go from here? How do you top this? Well, as the subsequent Star Wars movies show, if you cannot further compress, if you've already reached the absolute essence of your idea, you can either keep it the same, or you can start adding complexity, start changing elements that, ever so slightly, dilute the original concept. If maintained on a small scale, this isn't necessarily an issue, just some harmless variation. But when this entropic movement starts taking place on a broader level, like let's say you have a really iconic movie about humanity's ultimate warriors facing the ultimate hunter, and you want more of it, but because you obviously cannot go any butcher than this, you change humanity's ultimate warrior into a regular everyman. And when that turns out to be not very successful, you start looking elsewhere. Let's say you find another iconic movie monster, one that has its own meanings and themes associated with it. But you don't care, you move it into your own story. A crossover event, that's pretty cool, right? The critics might say no, but $177 million at the box office definitely says yes. That's more money than the original movies made combined. This is the way. You forget about storytelling, forget about themes and meanings. Everything turns into content. Content that can be smashed together, rebranded, revived. Everyone is loving it. Money starts flowing in like never before. You learn to embrace the disorder, the outward expansion. What else is possible?
Franz,
well,
welcome
you
to
will
today. How you
soon
doing?
find out, because you're about to enter
The era of Marvelization. So yeah, no, and I'm thinking over here, there are so many ways you can re-explore a story. You can take these very essential. Let's bring it back to the lightsaber, since it's been his focal point so far. We talked about this the other day. How interesting would it have been if the sequel trilogy had focused on Finn and Poe? Finn being the former stormtrooper turned Jedi, and Poe being this iteration of Han Solo. Sometimes you can retell stories. No, we don't have song requests on today. That's for Wednesday. We're doing that on Wednesday. I think, we're doing reacts right now, and this is the last one of the day. After this, we're gonna boot up Alan Wake. So, Alan Wake 2, by the way. We grab the idea of the lightsaber, and we take some of the concepts that we've already done, and we explore them in a different way. The problem is, there is only a finite number of ways that you can do this, but there are always stories that you can make. But the problem is, some of these are risky. And that's not what the box office demands. So, yeah. No. Like, the extended universe in Star Wars explored a lot of this. Many times it was bad. Sometimes it was brilliant. And they took those risks, since it was, mostly written and, physical media. But yes, speaking of how many ways you can retell a story, look at how many iterations we have of what if Superman evil. Yeah, and a lot of the times it's because the focal point has to be that. It can't, it sometimes could be these things. Just look at all the remakes of Cinderella that we've had. How many retellings of Cinderella have we had? Especially by Disney. I can tell you, I've watched at least 4 of them, some of which I really liked. My favorite one was, I think it was Hilary Duff, which was basically the story of Cinderella told from a suburban diner girl perspective, whose stepmother inherited the diner, and the whole plot is centered around the diner. And she's in high school, and baseball team or football team, whatever. And it's that. And it's the story of Cinderella told in this different setting with these different sets of values and this different perspective. And it was nice. It was nice. So, no, we're not going to go back to Control. We've been playing through Alan Wake 2. So we're going to do that. Anyway, let's continue. I have millions of dollars. Please make something better.
So now for the main thesis. To live in the era of Marvelization is to live in a time where storytelling entropy has become a widespread phenomenon that affects cinema in a multitude of different ways.
It's become the norm.
Some obvious, others less so. And so to properly discuss the full scope of this new cinematic culture, I have broken it down into 3 key features that I believe broadly capture its main characteristics. With the first and most obvious being the rise of franchise building.
Hollow franchises, yes.
You become part of a bigger universe. You just don't know it yet.
Most of the blame for this one seems to fall on Marvel.
Yep.
They did, after all, bring the idea of franchise building into the mainstream and started the trend of major studios actively planning ahead for crossover events and other future stories that increasingly diminished the idea of the standalone movie. But it is also a bit more complicated than that. In fact, there's an argument to be made that in the beginning, Marvel was actually engaged in anti-entropic storytelling. It was just doing so on a bigger scale than we were used to.
Yeah, first...
Looking back on it now, it's pretty
films,
obvious that it was never really Marvel's intention to use one movie to tell one self-contained story, or even to create a series of movies in the traditional sense where you would end up with a few sequels or a trilogy or something. Instead, they wanted to establish an entire cinematic universe containing a vast multitude of individual stories that are all interconnected with each other, and that slowly converge over time through a series of team-ups and showdowns until ultimately coming together in one giant finale.
Assemble.
Yeah.
That was their core idea. And if you just look at the Infinity Saga, starting with Iron Man and ending with Avengers Endgame, I do believe they pulled it off.
They did.
They took this comic book idea of a shared universe that gradually expands and brought us along with it over the course of more than a decade to what is generally considered to be a satisfying conclusion. Does this mean that every movie in the Infinity Saga was a masterpiece?
God, no.
No. But again, that was never the point. Individual movies in the Marvel franchise are more like Adventure of the Week kind of stories. They're part of a continuum that isn't designed to be groundbreaking with each individual entry, but that occasionally crescendos in these more monumental events, and that uses the time in between to connect us closer to the characters. Or at least that's how I personally learned to appreciate these movies. So where then does franchise building become entropic? Where does it become detrimental to the actual storytelling? Well, we see this most clearly in the way other studios looked at Marvel and took all the wrong lessons from it.
I'm going to say, before he continues so that I can give my take here, I would say the problem is that there was never a plan. Because this happened with Star Wars, this happened with Marvel. Once you ran out of the plan, it all goes wrong. Because then you're trying to improvise as you go. And the problem with improvisation is that unless you really know what you're doing, you're not going to pull it off. You're not going to pull it off, and they have failed. In my opinion, after Endgame, yes, you have like the epilogues. Hell, it happened to Halo 2. It's happened to a lot of franchises, sadly, that they've been trying to squeeze out of it. And in my opinion, what you do is what God of War did. Because God of War pulled it off. Because you had the first 3 God of Wars, which was Kratos going against the Greek gods. And it culminates with God of War 3 as he finally gets to Zeus, he finally gets Pandora's box, and everything ends. And all these interconnected games, it wasn't just 1, 2, and 3. I think there was a couple more games in there. And once that is done, you wrap it up and you start over. And that's what they did. Because the new God of War 4, is now he goes to the Norse gods, which we still have to play, but I digress. Is it on the list? Is it on the list? Let me... is God of War on the list? Yes, it is. So you have that. In my opinion, after Endgame, you make maybe an epilogue movie for the characters. Like, in my opinion, Spider-Man No Way Home, great epilogue. Leave it at that. Leave it at that. The universe does not continue after that. It's all wrapped up in a nice little bow, and you can keep the same universe if you want, and have hints of it here and there, and you just start over. And you start from scratch, and you start from that seed once again. Something, the James Cinematic Universe? Jesus Christ, no. No, please, no. Holy fuck, no. No, a bunch of incoherent stories. No. Because a place where this happens a lot is, and I know you're probably gonna be a bit disoriented when I say this, is wrestling. Because a lot of the story, because as we all know, wrestling is a lot of the times predetermined, is where a lot of people get their acting career started. Like, it's no longer Broadway or Hollywood. You can also start in wrestling, because a good part of wrestling is acting, and you have to act out these storylines. And a lot of these will build up over years. For example, WWE had the storyline of the Bloodline, where it started with, there's these group of guys who are family, who are actually related, and one of them is the champion, and he's been reigning, and the family's been helping him out, and there's this outsider who comes in and wants to join the family, and he spends like a year and a half every week trying to pull off something and everything. And they're just bringing it, they're just building up the story, and more people are getting involved and everything. And it culminates in one of the WrestleManias when Cody Rhodes finally wins the championship, finally dethrones the Bloodline, and it all goes away. That's it. And then a few months later, they start the new Bloodline, and they bring new talent with it, and the story starts again in a small scale, and they've been building it to, once again this year, I think it just happened last night, WrestleMania, once again after a couple of years of build-up, it all comes to a climax, and come Monday night, it's gone. They're going to start something over. They're going to start something new. And sometimes they will take story beats from the 80s or 90s and they will just say, okay, who are two people that we have that could be characters that work with it? And they just retell that old story. They remake these stories, but with the new talent, under the new context and everything. So, let's see, 343's greatest mistake was making their first independent Halo game be Halo 4. Yep, the second greatest mistake is making Halo 4. Halo ODST and Halo Reach proved that Halo games can be massively successful without Master Reach. Yes. Absolutely. I did play Reach all the way through. I haven't played ODST. And I think that is a cool thing when you take the universe and you just start somewhere else. You just tell the story of someone else. And that's that. And you just take the universe like that. You can still build upon the franchises. You can have hint, hit, nudge, nudge moments at when they acknowledge Master Chief or something that is happening, and you're just bringing it somewhere else completely. And that's it. That's, in my opinion, how you start franchises over. Let's see if he identifies a similar problem.
Took that idea of a shared universe and
Or if
employed it
my
not so
conclusion
much
is
as a
similar.
storytelling device, but more so as a marketing model. We saw this with DC, which,
Oh, yeah.
among other issues, didn't
gave
take
up.
the time to let us connect with the characters and instead tried to force its grand finales into existence before the audience was given a reason to actually care.
Oh, God, yeah.
We saw it with the Dark Universe, which didn't really seem to consider if there even was a worthwhile connection between its stories and characters to begin with. And we saw it with the recent expansion of Star Wars, which definitely had potential as it offers a vast, fantastical universe with enough room for all kinds of loosely connected stories.
Yeah.
But which unfortunately still can't seem to let go of the handful of characters and storylines from the original trilogy that everything keeps coming back to.
That was Disney hiring
But Marvel
incompetent
too
writers.
is clearly
Yeah.
struggling post-Endgame. We have more characters and more stories than ever before.
Way too
A lot
much.
of them now taking place in long form on television. And it's just becoming too much. You know, it's like the weekly adventure has become daily homework, which not only makes it harder to keep up with everything that's going on, but it also makes the interconnectivity feel less meaningful. There still isn't a strong setup for a major storyline like the Infinity War. I know they're messing around with the multiverse, but we've only seen it very sporadically and
What is
I'm
this from?
just not
1 year ago,
feeling
yeah.
a strong sense of anticipation here.
Yeah.
And also, there still doesn't seem to be a strong new cast of core characters.
They've
We've
leaned
been
on it way too
introduced to
much, yeah.
dozens of new faces, but a lot of them seem to come and go without being given a proper chance to become the new Iron Man or Captain America, to become those leading characters who are a sort of constant in what is otherwise a sea of variables.
And the most important thing, I am not apologizing for pausing this. It's not just that we are not getting a new Captain America or we're not getting a new Thor or a new Iron Man. It's that they are actively trying to, instead of doing a passing of the torch, actively replace the characters. They want to keep that brand associated, which is a bad idea. Going back to the example of wrestling that I just said, there was Eddie Guerrero, one of the greatest Latino wrestlers to ever exist. That guy had everything, had the charisma, had the moves and everything. And now, tangentially, they brought Dominic Mysterio, the son of Rey Mysterio, and he is the new Eddie Guerrero. He's not replaced Eddie Guerrero. He just has a lot of the traits that he had. He has the charisma. He's got like the asshole moves, all that kind of stuff. But he's still his own thing. They don't call him Mini Guerrero or Eddie Mysterio or Eddie Guerrero. He's his own character. He's his own separate entity. And he's been given the torch. He's been passed the torch of a great character. What Disney has done with Marvel is that they're flat out, oh yeah, this one's Iron Man now. But better, because this one is younger and more diverse. Captain America, this fucking Sam, he had his own superpowers. And he was cool as the Falcon. But no, he has to be the new, better Captain America, better than the old one, you remember, because this one is diverse, or whatever other bullshit reasons they're trying to give. They're not passing the torch. They're not giving you new characters. They are giving you somewhat similar characters, and they're trying to get you to replace the characters that you already know, which is a bad idea. 343 could have given us the Harvest campaign when the Covenant as new and scary and the UNSC had absolutely no fucking clue how to properly fight them. Instead, we have microtransaction cat ears and probably a battle royale mode in the next main game. Yeah. So sad.
The important thing to remember about storytelling entropy is that it is persistent. It's always moving towards more and more disorder.
Yep.
And so, as it keeps pushing these
Spirals out of
franchises
control very
further
fast.
outwards into the void, further away from a unifying center, insofar as they were able to establish one in the first place, it also starts to break down their more fundamental assumptions. For in its most entropic, disordered state, franchise building is not about a shared universe. It's merely about recognizability, which leads us to the second key feature of Marvelization.
Meta references to nowhere. There you
I
go.
should start by giving you some context.
A while back, I went to go see the Dungeons and Dragons movie, which
It was a
was
fun movie.
pretty fun.
Stupid
but
movie,
at the
but fun.
end, when the main villain was all but defeated, there's this little joke.
I think you got her.
Regardless if you think it's funny or not, that's straight from the Avengers, right?
Yep.
I mean, the meta connection here is unavoidable. Marvel itself even did a callback to it in Thor Ragnarok. But why is it here in this completely unrelated movie? A deliberate homage? A cheap ripoff? Either way, it seems to signify
say
a
yes.
form of interconnectivity or meta-awareness that we've been seeing a lot more of, and that a lot of people seem to dislike.
Look for a box.
Okay. In the case of D&D, that movie had Marvel-like humor the whole time around. So I would say I understand his example. I kind of disagree with this because the D&D movie was probably the most ideal Marvel movie that there could be, because you go into D&D understanding that it's going to be stupid nonsense. And that the humor is going to be quippy like that, because that's kind of what happens in these campaigns when you play it. So, having it the owlbear do that, it perfectly encapsulates a player being like, oh yeah, the owlbear comes in, and you remember how in like the Avengers Hulk thrashes? Yeah, the owlbear does that. So it kind of makes sense within the movie, but I still see his point. We could have given an RTS game depicting the war in space where the Covenant had an even greater advantage. Oh, that would have been cool. Yeah.
It says MacGuffin.
Though not always, because here again the issue is a bit more complicated than it initially seems. Being self-aware and including meta-commentary is not bad in itself. It can be used very effectively in stories where self-reflection is the point, where it's actually an integral part of the story. We see this in movies such as Synecdoche, New York, The Fabelmans, or Asteroid City, which are all specifically about the dynamics of art and about the act of creation, and which therefore almost naturally draw attention to their own storytelling.
Ironically, we're
I'd
playing
even
Alan
say
Wake,
Deadpool
so...
was successful in this sense because the core idea of its central character is that he is a superhero who is more or less aware that he's inside of a superhero story, which makes it fitting that he occasionally comments on the tropes of the genre that he's being subjected to.
Superhero landing.
Nice.
You gotta do a superhero landing.
Meta-commentary can also be included as a part of the subtext that enriches the main story. Take for example how Christopher Nolan's The Prestige and Inception both symbolically reflect the dynamics of filmmaking to add weight to their stories that, each in their own way, are centered around deception and crafting illusions.
You create the world of the dream, and they fill it with their subconscious.
The trouble starts when
The thing is that when movie didn't depict a D&D campaign, it was a straight-up movie set in D&D. If there were cuts of a group of playing D&D occasionally, I would agree with you. Yeah, I concede. I concede to that, yeah. Because the thing is, yes, when I think of Dungeons and Dragons, I always think of people playing the game. But as a standalone thing, your point stands, and his point stands. So, 100%. You're right.
this kind of self-awareness is not connected to the actual story, when it's not contributing to the core idea but instead directs your attention away from it. The most obvious form of this kind of meta-referencing that we've been seeing a lot of recently is nostalgia baiting.
D&D anime, there you go.
I'm something of a scientist myself.
Here again, including nostalgia in a movie isn't necessarily a bad thing. It is, after all, a powerful emotion that's part of the human experience and therefore worth exploring through cinema. But when it doesn't meaningfully contribute to the story at hand and is just there for the audience's sake in a "hey, remember this" kind of way, that's when nostalgia merely generates disorder, or entropy.
And in the case of Marvel, it's even worse, because these are not wink wink, nudge nudge, I know that you watched this, is that everything requires you to have watched the previous things. You have to have consumed the previous product in order to enjoy the current product, and the problem is that the previous product is a bloated series of series.
A few examples of this, with rising degrees of severity, would be Benedict Cumberbatch weirdly emphasizing his real name is Khan in Star Trek Into Darkness, despite that name having no meaning to the characters in the story. Jurassic World pretty much pausing the entire plot to soulfully remind you of the other dinosaur movie that was actually good. And The Flash doing whatever this was. And the interesting thing is that, over time, it feels like these kinds of references started happening even without the nostalgia factor. Like the earlier mentioned Dungeons & Dragons example. There's a ton of movies now that seem to want to invoke some sense of interconnectivity, be it a reference to some other recent movie or just some inside joke. Take for example how Ghosted, a movie that has nothing to do with Marvel, still had this sequence with a lot of ex-Avengers showing up, and Chris Evans doing his little Captain America fists. Though these references were clearly deliberate, they are not true homages as they have existed throughout cinematic history. That is, references in the form of loving tributes to a movie or a filmmaker that, in some way, served as an inspiration. Like the way John Wick 4 invoked the iconic scene transition from Lawrence of Arabia, or how the 2014 Godzilla reboot showed its reverence for Steven Spielberg's Jurassic Park. No, these are references to nowhere. References for the sake of making a reference. They are part of the wider memification of our culture in which recognizability equals entertainment, where our attention is increasingly pushed into purposeless disorder, and where it becomes increasingly difficult to engage stories with commitment and sincerity. Here we might be moving into the broader cultural issue of irony poisoning. The idea that we can no longer communicate sincerely and with vulnerability and have to turn everything into a joke instead. I've already discussed this more thoroughly in a different video, but I do want to briefly bring it up again here because I do believe that from a purely storytelling perspective, this kind of ironic detachment is an entropic force. Because when you have, let's say, a character who is struggling with her identity, you can create a nice little moment where she finds meaning in the kind words of someone who cares about her. But if you then do this...
Is that, like, really corny?
So corny.
You immediately disconnect the audience from the emotion of the scene and undermine the core idea at the basis of her entire character arc. It's hard to say though if it's because of our culture becoming less sincere and more ironic that we have more storytelling entropy, or that it's because of this kind of storytelling entropy that we became less sincere and more ironic. Either way, both. I do think there is some relation here, and I don't believe it has served our stories for the better.
Ugh, that is so terrible.
The thing about both the rise of franchise building and the growing meta-awareness is that they are not necessarily driven by storytellers themselves, but by the larger industry they exist in. And this brings us to the final and most nebulous key feature of Marvelization.
Corporate passion!
And turned it into something trivial.
Now, I'm not an industry insider, and so I don't want to go too deeply into the broader industry developments that have undoubtedly been affecting how movies are made, such as the rise of streaming services and the decline of the movie star and the mid-budget production. But I do want to explore the more indirect effect that these developments have had on the actual storytelling in movies, even if this is based on more of an intuitive feeling rather than a factual observation. Not too long ago, I was watching The Rings of Power, the Amazon series based on The Lord of the Rings and the broader mythology that surrounds it. And This is coming from a huge Lord of the Rings fan, someone who was genuinely hoping to be transported back into this world in the same way that I was when the first movies came out.
Not happening.
But I just wasn't feeling it. Not even a little bit. There are some clearly observable problems with its storytelling that contributed to this lackluster experience.
I wonder
but even
what.
when putting those aside, there just wasn't any magic here.
Yeah.
It's a feeling I've been having a lot in the recent years. The feeling that all the projects that should appeal to me, and that seem to be given the time and the budget to really become something special, and that on the surface look like they're doing everything right. I mean, look at these shots. They are beautiful, right? And yet, they do nothing for me. Try as I might, I can't seem to connect with these new stories.
Again, I was watching Filmento. He was making a critique of Zack Snyder in his film Rebel Moon. And he pointed out something. He attributed it to Zack Snyder, but I think this might apply to the larger industry. Zack Snyder, and I'm going to encompass it here so that we have a focal point. Zack Snyder is incapable of telling a story in the present. Everything has to depend on the past, or is something that you're going to do in the future. You're either building up to something, or you are referencing something that happened, but you never bother telling what is happening. And you never bother focusing on the present. Now, could this be because the people in this industry nowadays, especially in Hollywood, is a bunch of narcissistic, self-centered, anxious, depressive pricks that have nothing other, that they cannot focus on the present, that they either have to focus on the future, on the past, or themselves, and thus are incapable of telling a story that happens in the present tense? I don't know. But if they were, I don't think they would be doing much else differently. And it definitely builds up, I think, upon this point.
I wondered, as any disillusioned adult at one point does. Is it just me? Am I romanticizing movies like The Lord of the Rings just because they were meaningful to me during my formative years?
No.
Well, to make sure, I treated myself to a little 4K Ultra HD trip down memory lane.
Nice.
And I realized, no, it's definitely not me. These movies are as incredible as they've always been. But it got me thinking, part of why I loved The Lord of the Rings so much was not just because of the movies themselves, but also because of how they were made. The Lord of the Rings was one of the first movies to come out with an extensive making-of series, which, apparently, isn't included with the new Blu-ray.
That's disappointing. Haha, nice. Look at that.
There we go. The appendices, as they were called, detailed the entire production process from the writing of the script to scouting the locations, building sets, finding the cast, basically everything from beginning to end. And the one thing that always stood out to me was the sheer amount of passion that was just so palpable in everyone and everything. To the 12-year-old that I was, it made filmmaking look like a magical experience. And this may have just been projection, but I'd swear I could feel this passion shining through in the final product.
You can always tell if something is well crafted and something is made out of passion. It's like when you say that food is made with, like, food made with love tastes better, kind of thing. We as humans do have that intuition, and many people will be able to tell something like that. Because if you are passionate about something, you will do it right no matter what. And I think his point about the behind the scenes, I don't know how to feel about that, because we do have, and it comes more nowadays in the form of YouTube videos and promotional material about the behind the scenes, and usually it just shows how things aren't well made nowadays.
It makes sense that passion is an anti-entropic force when it comes to storytelling, perhaps even one of the strongest ones. Because passion is what drives filmmakers and everyone involved in the filmmaking process to work with absolute commitment to condense their vision to that absolute state of perfection. And this is exactly what so often seems to be missing today.
Yeah. They
when
bring
you
in
look at
random
many
writers.
of the bigger properties in recent years, it just feels like they're not initiated by this kind of creative passion, but rather by studios and producers that want to make certain movies or TV shows,
and many
not
times
because
they
they're
hate the
just
source
yearning
material
to tell these stories, but because they are part of a bigger vision, a more entropic vision that looks outward to include financial ambitions, marketing strategies, franchise potential, and all those other things that don't serve the actual storytelling.
Yep.
It's the difference between creating Game of Thrones and creating a show like Game of Thrones. The first is born from the passion to create something new. In this case, to bring a complex and subversive fantasy story to a wide audience that normally wouldn't be into this kind of thing.
Yep.
The second one just recognizes the success of something else and wants something similar.
Man, The Witcher.
In other words, when it comes to corporate passion, it's not so much about the actual story, but about the appearance of a certain kind of story. I don't believe Amazon was just aching to create Citadel. They just wanted an international spy series. Similarly, I don't buy that anyone was dying to create The Grey Man or Red Notice or Ghosted. They were just items in the bigger streaming service shopping cart that were selected because, building on the previously discussed features of Marvelization, they had enough recognizable elements and enough franchise potential to be worth pursuing.
That, along with the fact that they didn't bother making it good. Because I can guarantee you, all of these franchises, all these movies, there is someone out there whose dream and who worked their entire life and has the craftsmanship to have made these flops into brilliant films. And they did not bother hiring this person for whatever reason. And instead, they are going back to their nepotistic circle of circle-jerking writers that have ruined things over and over again. I don't think it's just the corporatization. It's connected still. And another reason. So.
Through this lens, we can also see why Game of Thrones deteriorated so significantly over the years. The passion behind it turned entropic. Instead of focusing on quality storytelling, the showrunners became increasingly concerned with fan service and with staying ahead of audience speculation, which caused them to make rather poor alterations to their original vision.
And they were bad.
And
they
instead
were bad
of
writers.
sticking with the
D&D
show
were bad
until
writers.
its natural ending, they got distracted by the promise of other projects, which resulted in them carelessly rushing towards the end. To be clear, I don't want this to sound like a black and white, fundamentally good versus fundamentally bad kind of thing. It's definitely not as dramatic as that. Passion projects still have to do with the business side, and corporate ordered products obviously still have passion involved. If you look a little closer at how Amazon acquired the partial rights to Tolkien's work to make their Rings of Power series, it becomes clear that the showrunners they hired are genuine fans and creators with the best of intentions. And I believe the same is true for J.J. Abrams, for example, when he was selected to reboot Star Wars, and for Colin Trevorrow when he got to do the same for Jurassic Park. But still, I can't help but feel there's a noticeable difference, even if only on a subconscious level, between movies that came into being because passionate filmmakers relentlessly pursued that green light from the studios, and movies that were first quote-unquote ordered by studios and had those passionate filmmakers coming in later. Perhaps the most shining example of this is the Hobbit trilogy, which had the same filmmakers behind it as The Lord of the Rings, but which just wasn't the same. The many behind-the-scenes problems of the Hobbit movies have already been widely documented, but the main one I want to emphasize here is that they were initially Guillermo del Toro's passion project, and were only later given to a reluctant Peter Jackson after a conflict with the studio. In other
I
words,
didn't know
when it
this.
comes down to it, The Hobbit was essentially The Lord of the Rings, but made with corporate passion instead of genuine passion. And to me, the results speak for themselves.
Oh, that's brutal. That's brutal, dude. I didn't know that. Breaking the cycle.
Despite Marvelization being a significant movement in cinematic culture, arguably the dominant one, it's not all-encompassing. No single trend in cinema ever is. There's obviously always interesting stuff being made outside of the bigger studio systems. But even within them, there are notable exceptions of movies that, on the surface, could easily have become another victim of Marvelization, but somehow managed to break free and deliver some genuinely great cinematic experiences. So how did they do it? Well, on that purely storytelling level we've been discussing, it's actually pretty simple.
Oh god, Tenet.
Just reverse the entropy again. Make original movies like Oppenheimer and Barbie that stand on their own without being forced into some larger cultural or cinematic framework of purposeless meta-references, and that have passionate filmmakers driving the production. Then burn down every existing franchise and just... wait. Actually, that's a bit too easy, right? Because how about all those sequels and franchise entries that we do love? How about... Top Gun Maverick was widely celebrated as a grand return to classical cinema. And sure, the movie had no business being as good as it was. But what was it really that made this feel so classical? The fact that they flew in actual planes? They didn't even do that in the original. That it told a standalone original story? Not really. It was still a sequel filled with nostalgia. What then separated it from movies like Ghostbusters Afterlife or the latest Indiana Jones? That it was just really, really good?
Good writers.
I think we can do better. I think the real reason why Maverick was such a success is because it is one of the rare examples in which a sequel takes the essence of its original idea and refines it even further.
Yep.
In other words,
100%.
it continued the story while not only avoiding storytelling entropy, but it actually managed to be anti-entropic. Because what's the essence of Top Gun? It's about these elite, best of the best pilots who have to push themselves to reach even greater heights, right? And the original definitely captured that, but not perfectly. If we ignore the cheesiness and just look at the actual story, you can see that the plot tends to meander a bit between different elements that are connected, but not as tight as it could have been. And this is exactly what's different about Maverick.
Pentagon has tasked us with assembling a strike team and taking it out.
By presenting us with a highly dangerous mission right at the very beginning, we have this clear arc that takes all of those other elements, the rivalry, the love story, the conflicts with the brass, and
really
so
good
on,
film.
and unites them into a more singular concept. It's like the movie recognized that the original was actually that sword lightsaber, and subsequently found a way to shave off the needless complexity and leave only the absolute essence.
Yep, there you go. Like I said.
Again, this
But he
kind
said
of
it better.
anti-entropic refinement is quite rare, especially for sequels. It usually takes a full-on remake, as we saw with The Thing, Ocean's 11, Invasion of the Body
I know.
Snatchers, and with what is shaping up to be the definitive adaptation of Dune.
Good to see you, man.
I
Take
think
care.
the best other example of a sequel going anti-entropic would be the Mission Impossible series, which initially played around with different forms of stylization and background stories before refining its core idea down to the basics.
That's just Tom
providing
Cruise.
entertaining espionage action and awe-inspiring stunt work.
Yep.
As an added bonus, which is also true for the John Wick series, if the core idea is less about the actual story and more about how that story is told, that is, if it's more about the action and the stunts, then it's also a lot easier to do the same thing multiple times before the entropy starts kicking in.
Yeah. Oof.
But there are other ways for sequels to build on a mostly perfected idea without becoming entropic. There is the James Cameron way, which means that if you already got a highly regarded classic, two of them actually, with no way to further perfect them, instead of telling the same story again in a watered down or more convoluted way, what you can do then is go back to the premise and change the core idea. turn the claustrophobic horror experience into a sprawling action thriller. And that machine that came back from the future to destroy humanity, well, let's have it come back again to protect it. By making these changes in the fundamental premise,
Flip the script,
Cameron could still explore the same central themes that were present in these stories, but do so from an entirely new starting point, which changed their context enough for them to not only feel fresh, but actually feel deepened and expanded upon.
People like Terminator 2 better
Another
than
great
1.
example
Yeah.
of this is of course The Dark Knight. The
Oh, yeah.
previous movie, Batman Begins, was a solid superhero origin story about how Bruce Wayne became Batman and changed Gotham City.
Yeah!
But The Dark Knight, as I've already discussed in my extensive review of Nolan's filmography, flips that premise around by confronting Bruce with the unintended consequences of his own actions.
Hell yeah,
It changes
brother.
Batman from an active to a reactive protagonist, and in doing so, deepens the vigilante tale with a whole new layer of fascinating complications and philosophical questions.
I've seen
Yeah.
what I would have to become to stop men like him.
Related to the James Cameron way, there's also the Francis Ford Coppola way, which I also like to refer to as envelopment, where you
Okay.
take your core idea and make it part of a bigger one. The Godfather was a story of one man's corruption, but after The Godfather Part 2, that story became part of a multi-generational saga that framed that corruption into a greater
still need
cycle
to
of
see those- I
violence
still need
and
to watch
family
those movies.
tragedies. The other obvious example here would be the original Star Wars trilogy, which took its archetypal hero's journey from A New Hope and turned it into the first stage of an even greater one by adding that second act conflict and desperation on a grand scale in The Empire Strikes Back, and by then using The Return of the Jedi to complete the new cycle.
Nice. Yep. Yep.
The key factor here, which is all too often forgotten, is knowing when this bigger story is completed, or for that matter, when any story or idea is completed.
Yeah.
Great storytelling, anti-entropic storytelling, is about creation, continued creation. It's about making something beautiful and then doing it all over again from a new point of inception. Entropy is the opposite of that. It's the outward movement towards that slow death that's always just over the horizon. A purgatory of empty eyes and hollow beauty, of faded originals and crystal clear forgeries. It's the forgotten memory of what was once
Crystal clear
real,
forgeries, I
and
like
what
that.
can be real again. But in order to achieve that, we have to be able to move on. We have to allow our stories to end. The problem with
Nice.
trying to construct a unifying theory is that it's never truly exhaustive, and neither is this one. I tried to focus as much as I could on the issues that I think are most directly related to the actual storytelling in movies, but because of this I had to exclude many others.
Yeah.
One such element that I think is also highly important but which is more indirectly related to the current state of cinema is the problem of us, the audience, and the way our engagement with movies has changed.
These damn
Because
Gen
even if there
Zers
are
and their
plenty of great
TikToks.
movies out there, and there are, this era of Marvelization has
Oh,
also
God,
made it so
right.
easy for us to fall into our own entropic state in which we just mindlessly consume whatever we are presented with, and passively settle for those cheap thrills of recognizability and the fleeting comfort of empty nostalgia. There
Good.
are, however, ways to break out of this cycle as well, and to become more actively engaged with cinema again. Over the years, I've personally used a few strategies that I found really helpful and really enjoyable.
Okay.
And luckily for you, they are now easier than ever, thanks to Mubi. You know, the
Okay, no, I'm gonna just give my point here before he talks about the sponsor. I'm so glad I don't watch movies. But no, it's one thing that we do have to take into consideration is that the landscape that we are in right now of corporate bloat is a land of opportunity for a lot of things to stand out. Why am I glad that I don't watch movies? Because then you're the one who curates them for me, Dunkel. But yeah, no, it's right now with just watch good movies. Yeah, I know. So I'm not gonna just go after it. I don't know where to start. That's what I have you for. But yeah, no. The fact that we have such a landscape of shit is going to give opportunity for quite a few things, because shit makes for a great fertilizer.
Curated online cinema streaming hand-picked exceptional movies from around the world. But first, here's what I used to do when I was feeling a bit uninspired. What I did was I categorized movies together so I could really immerse myself into the work of a specific director or a certain era of filmmaking.
Okay.
But this was easier said than done, as I often found myself not knowing where to look or where to go next. And that's what's so great about Mubi. Again, Mubi is a curated online cinema, meaning that every movie is carefully selected so you know you're always going to be watching something interesting. And furthermore, they offer lots of fascinating series that have connected me to filmmakers, subcultures, and entire genres that I otherwise wouldn't even have known about. It's just such an incredibly refreshing and enriching way to explore the best that cinema has to offer, and to reinvigorate your passion for it. If you want to try it out for yourself, you can do so by going to mubi.com/likestoriesofold to get 30 days for free. That's mubi.com/likestoriesofold to claim your extended free trial and to start reconnecting with cinema today.
Yeah, but I don't need this. I don't need this, but music license from Music Bed. Please consider supporting me on patreon.com/likestoriesofold to help make more videos. Thanks. Says here, thanks for the generous donations of his Patreon. So now he's listing them all over here. What a brilliant video. Skyhopes, welcome to today. How you doing? This was brilliant, dude. This was, yeah, and he encapsulates the problems with the Marvelization of cinema. Yeah, you were right, yeah. It was really, really good. It was so well made, too. It was so well made, holy shit. But, yeah, this... 100% agree. I 100% agree with this guy. And... entropy. Entropy being one of the root causes, or the issue with the three symptoms, with the three main drivers, I would say. Yeah. Okay, and I just want to see if there's anything else here. Okay, no, so it just ends. So there you have it. That was the Marvelization of cinema by Like Stories of Old. What a good video. What a good video. Holy shit. There you have it. And yeah, I do think that the Chaos Lord calling entropy bad is pretty ironic. Hey, I am only chaotic lawful, okay? I ain't no lord yet. I ain't got no land just yet. But no, it's such it's so true. Yeah. Marvel's already going back to formula. You can see with the new Fantastic Four movie take place in another universe out of main Marvel community continuity. Good. As they probably should. Like, as I said, I am okay with them keeping the overall cinematic universe and just kind of like passively acknowledge it. But I'm not okay with it being the whole thing. Frixie, welcome to today. How you doing? I'm doing fantastic. I'm doing fantastic. It's Monday. It's Easter. Happy Easter, everybody. And yeah, no, and I think that these studios are finally going to let go, because that's what they've been not wanting to do. You're making a burger? Hell yeah, brother. This is what these studios did not want to do. They did not want to let go of these things. At some point it becomes sunk cost, right? We've come this far, why would we let go of it? They need to start over. They need to start small again, feel it fresh. Because again, going back to the example of the Marvels, because I watched a video earlier today. Another YouTuber I really recommend is Filmento, because he breaks down a lot of these in a way shorter takes. He didn't go as deep as this guy, and yes, this guy talked about things nothing to do with the culture. Because on top of these issues, you have the culture in Hollywood right now that is definitely not helping. Then when that's done. I'm going to get started on hand priming the next Chimera. Hell yeah! Are you gonna hand prime it, or are you gonna spray paint it with primer? And yeah, I think they just need to let go. That's all they need to do. They need to let go. They need to start over against entropy. They need to be organized in that sense. Because at this point, yeah, the Marvels, like the guy like Filmento was talking about all these, and it was, by the way, I'm gonna like and subscribe to this video because it was really good. And he was talking about how the villain could be anyone, because the villain is really just 3 artifacts from 3 random films from Marvel. And that's it. And almost everything that happens, in order for you to understand it, you need to have watched everything from Marvel. So the film cannot stand by itself. Goes back to the thing I was saying, right? That these filmmakers have become incapable of telling a story in the now, and everything is either building up for something massive down the line, or is referencing something in the distant past, but it is never able to just be in the moment. So, too many to spray. Okay. Do you want to do anime smash or pass? I need to use the bathroom, but you know what? We should start Alan Wake soon, but you know what? Let's do that. Let's do that just for the fun of it. And we are week and a week and a half away from Thunderbolts. It looks like A24 art movie with greater creative team. Oh, nice. I don't keep up with film too much, so that's probably something for Dunkel to do. But yes, so let me use the bathroom real quick, and then we're gonna do a smash or pass.